So apparently the stream is live. I haven't done something like this in quite some time. All right, so it is technically not 3:30 yet. Just under 4 minutes to go until I get this started. I'm not really thinking this build should take too long. And this will be archived afterwards. I'm still debating whether or not I'm going to add timestamps to the VOD after this. But I think I might, depending on how long this is overall. So currently just waiting for 3:30 to hit. Should allow a couple more people to come on through. Currently up to 5 viewers. One of which happens to be myself. So if I just turn the camera over here, my laptop is showing the part list as well as the stream itself, so I can monitor the chat. So if any questions come through, I could go ahead and address those. For those who are watching right now, if you can let me know how the audio quality is. I didn't do any adjustments to the audio, so I have no idea how this sounds right now. So I don't think the stream is on low latency mode, so one trick I've found is that if you're on a desktop player, you can adjust the playback speed to 1.5 to 2x. And then that will sort of move ahead in the buffer a little bit so that it's not as far behind. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started, and obviously this is everything here. But actually, before I do that, what I'd like to do is sort of talk about my current PC and why I am upgrading. So let me see if I can easily move this to a different area real quick. And I will actually go over to where my current PC is to show what that looks like. Whoops, so if we just go on over here, we are currently where my existing PC has been for years. So just trying to shorten the length of my tripod a little bit, like so. Here it is. This is an Endermax Hoplite ST case in white. It is a ATX case. It's been part of that reason is why I went with a micro ATX build. I just don't really want to have extra space and extra PCI Express slots that I'm not even going to use. So that just having kind of a smaller space will have obviously a more compact PC and so on. So I'll try and get a little bit closer to the side panel. We can take a quick look inside. Obviously, any way to turn on the flash. To turn years ago, 8.5. That's using the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Plus heatsink fan. It has been working just fine. It keeps an overclocked i7 cooled very well. And all of that is plugged into an MSI Z68A GD80 motherboard. And realistically, everything has been working just fine since this was originally put together. But there are two main reasons why I wanted to upgrade. And let's go back to the kitchen where the new PC is being put together, of all places. So we're back in the work area, and the two main reasons why I wanted to upgrade is the first one, well, in no particular order. The first one is because I wanted to, well, let me go the other way. Computer hardware nowadays is extremely attractive, from AMD's Ryzen processors to the new super lineup of NVIDIA GPUs. It was just a really attractive and a pretty good time to build something newer that's faster, that's more energy efficient, and so on. So that was one reason. The other reason is I recently upgraded my monitor from a 24-inch 1080p 60Hz display to a 27-inch 1440p 155Hz display. Obviously, with an increased resolution and increased refresh rate, you're going to need better parts to achieve both that resolution and frame rate in games. You could also decrease the video quality, which is what I have been doing in Overwatch and Rocket League, but I kind of miss the better visuals. And especially for AAA games, I'd like to be able to turn up that stuff even more. So those are the two main reasons for wanting to do a new build. And I think this will adjust the camera real quick, which is my phone. It's pretty limiting, and it does not allow me to resume a scheduled event. I would have to create a new one, which I did not want to do. All right, so we're up to 4 viewers, which is actually more than I was thinking would show up. Now, before I do the actual build, let's go ahead and talk about the parts that I have selected. Starting with the first item on the Newegg list, which is the motherboard. So this is the ASRock X570 Pro 4 AM4 micro ATX board. This is the only X570 compatible motherboard right now that is micro ATX. So it has PCI Express 4.0. It's worth noting that none of the items I'm using in this build are actually PCI Express 4.0 at all. So I'm not really getting any use out of that, but later on, was released, but that has not been the case yet. So this is really the only option for a good, quote, high-end micro ATX Ryzen 3000 compatible motherboard. The next item on the Newegg list is actually a case fan, which is a Fractal design dynamic GP12 120mm low profile fan. So it's actually the same one that comes included with the case. So there's one in the back as an exhaust and one in the front as an intake. So for the front, I could add another one. And because I like the fans that come with the case, I opted to just get the same model to have 2 intakes on the front. Speaking of the case, that's the next thing that happens to be in the Newegg shopping list. So this is the Fractal Design Define Mini C TG. This is a micro ATX case, mostly black. Obviously, there's a tempered glass side panel. And here we are taking a closer look at the rear. So there's that rear fan, same one as the one on the table right there. And because it's micro ATX, it has up to 5 expansion slots in the back. There are some sound dampening side panels included as well, which is nice. Up top is a magnetic dust filter. By default, it came with just a hard. Let's see. Next up on the shopping list. Oh, thank goodness for touchscreens. The heatsink fan. So this is the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4 CPU cooler with silent wings. That's what they call their fans, I guess. So it's a really large heatsink fan combination. As you can see here, 2 tower setup. I don't remember if I did this or not, but I'm pretty sure there's enough space in the case to occupy this heatsink fan, but it will be a push-pull setup, so air so case fan as an exhaust should help. So next up, we got the video card, which is the I've been having a bad habit of calling RTX cards GTX cards. So this is the RTX 2070 Super. Connection is a bit laggy for me. Hopefully it gets better. I should probably just switch to Wi-Fi. Download speeds over LTE are really fast where I am, but sometimes the upload speed can be a little iffy. Although I do have the same stream up on my laptop and it appears to be okay. For maybe a 10% gain in performance, it just didn't seem practical whatsoever. So I fell back to a 2070 Super, and I actually considered the Radeon RX 5700 XT, but unfortunately, custom coolers are not available. It's just reference designs, and based on the reviews so far, they get extremely hot, and given how much it would have cost for a custom cooled 5700 XT, it's not really that much cheaper than a 2070 Super. This came in at $499. A 5700 XT with a custom cooler likely would have been maybe just $50 cheaper, so $450. So I opted to just get the 2070, get the better performance and the better cooling. Sticks of DDR4 3600 megahertz RAM. I believe the cast latency on these is either 16 or 17, but just 2 sticks, not 4. Leaving 2 slots open will allow me to expand to 32 gigs in the future if I ever decide to do that. They look pretty clean as well. No RGB on these, but like I said, the design is pretty nice and I like the way they look. They should go well with kind of a darkened color scheme with some white accents from the case fans and a couple of other items. Next up on the shopping list is the SSD number 2. This is the Patriot VPN100 1 terabyte SSD. I really wish they used a black PCB. Fortunately, the heatsink that they put on it should cover up most of it, but that's really the only non-black or white component in this build. Fortunately, also, I'm not even going to be looking inside of here, so that's not a big deal. This is going to be where I'm going to put games and documents. Next up on the list is another SSD, another M.2 SSD rather. It's a Corsair Force MP510. It is just 240 gigs, but this is where my operating system and programs will be. I much prefer rather having 2 separate drives rather than one larger drive with 2 partitions. If one fails, then at least the other one is still available. Next up is the power supply, which is right here, the Corsair TX750M. It is a semi-modular power supply. I almost went with a fully modular power supply, but then I remembered I'm not having any 3.5-inch drives or any 2.5-inch drives that would need to be plugged in. So there really shouldn't be many extra cables needed. Obviously, we're going to have the motherboard power, CPU power, and then the PCI Express power for the video card. Because there is a 3.5-inch hard drive in my old PC, I'm just going to plug that into this one when I first get everything set up so I could do a bunch of transfers of games and files rather than having to re-download everything. And then last but not least is the processor, which is right here. Whoops. This is the Ryzen 7 3700X, fairly fresh processor. AMD has finally gotten to the point where, since I primarily game, their processors are now really comparable to Intel's. For multi-core performance, they are generally up to hundreds more than the 3700X, while for gaming performance, primarily single-threaded applications, it's still very comparable. Sometimes on par with an 8700K, maybe a little bit slower, but not by enough. So given the price, this processor really made a lot of sense. And that's it in terms of all of the parts that will be going into this. Before I continue, I would like to say one thing. The I/O shield looks like on a near $200 motherboard. This to me is just as generic as it gets, and I was hoping it would be blackened, it would have colored labels for some of the ports, and just smaller touches like that, but I guess ASRock didn't want to go that far. But, so, this app is saying I have a bitrate of 0 kilobits per second, but I can tell on my stream on my laptop, it appears to be working fine still, so I don't know who to believe. with all of that out of the way, I think it is ready to put this together. So hopefully the noise from the tripod isn't that problematic. Nate says it's super laggy. I don't know why. Like, I'm literally watching the stream on my laptop and it's smooth. It's not skipping frames or anything. So I don't know who to believe. Anyway, so the first thing I always start with when it comes to a new build is getting the motherboard prepped on the motherboard itself before putting anything in the case. For some reason, my little cheapo phone tripod mount, whoops, turn the screen off again. The tripod mount it comes loose even though I'm not really moving things around that much. Anyway, there we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is prep the motherboard. The most fragile component here in this entire build outside of the $500 GPU is the processor. So I will install that first. So if anybody has installed a processor before, it's fairly straightforward. You just have to line it up since it can only go in one way. Very funny, Nate. I will never set hands on an iPhone ever again. Ever. Ever, 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 ever. Unless I find it in a river, in which case it will be placed onto eBay. So here is the bottom end of the 3700X. AMD puts the pins directly onto the processor, whereas Intel puts those on the motherboard. So we've got a couple of minor differences there. I like how quickly my S10's camera focuses on what I want. Nice. Okay, so first thing is to lift the retention arm up like so. Carefully place the processor where it needs to go, which appears to be this way. Kind of just dropped in, which is good. Next up, we'll just bring the retention arm down, lock it into place, not going anywhere. All AMD processors, and probably Intel, come with a little case sticker. I am not planning on putting any stickers on this case. Yes, this will be the main desktop to replace what I built initially 8 years ago. That PC has seen a couple of upgrades. For example, the power supply has died twice. The video card was updated to a better one. That one eventually died. So of course that was upgraded to the GTX 1060 that it currently has. So the processor's in there. I'm going to get the RAM installed next. Another item that only is installed one way. And the reason I'm putting the RAM on early is because I want to make sure that the heatsink's fan has enough clearance. RAM was incredibly easy to install. Next up, the SSDs. So this motherboard has a dedicated heatsink that goes over one of the SSDs. I'm going to be putting the MP510 under there since it doesn't have its own heatsink fan, meaning the Viper will go right here. Not too bad. Interestingly, I thought this motherboard came with dedicated M.2 screws in their own little bags. At least I'm pretty sure that's what they're for. Right there. I actually did check the slots for the RAM. In fact, the motherboard came with a sheet dedicated to that. So here it tells you which modules, or rather which slots to occupy first. So A1 and then B1. I think. So at first I thought this was a little bit confusing because are both sticks, should they both go in the A slots so that they're right next to each other? Typically, if you're only going with a dual channel setup, you have one space in between. So do I occupy A1 and B1 or A1 and A2? I would just assume that it's A1 and B1. But now that you brought it up, I'm going to open up the manual and double check what it recommends as being the correct slots. Actually, on second thought, there's a table below here. A2 and B2 are occupied. There is no instance where A1 and B1 are filled in. So yeah, let me crank out that manual real quick. Oh, hold on. There's actually another side to this. Oh, that's for the older AMD processors. So bear with me a moment while I open up the manual. I'm thinking A2 and B2 might be the correct slots. I don't know. On that note, a while back I did see if this actually mattered, and some say that it does, some say that it doesn't. I would assume that since AMD systems are a little more gosh, what's the word? Specific when it comes to RAM placement, that it actually does matter. And the manual does not say. Yeah, it's really not straightforward. In this case, ASRock makes it really hard to understand. So just tell me which slots 2 sticks of RAM are supposed to go in. This does not really tell me. But I am thinking that A2 and B2 need to be occupied first. In which case, where I have them now is not correct. You know what? I'm going to Google it real quick because I don't want to have to do this whole thing again. Actually, screw it. I will put everything in A2 and B2. Fortunately, RAM is easy to swap out. If this is incorrect, so there's B2 and then here's A2, like so. On second thought, I will Google this real quick, because I would like to save time. Let's see, which slots do I put the RAM in? So the first article I looked up, it has the right slot populated first and then the rest, which is how I have it here. So I'm going to look up a couple of additional articles just to confirm, and I'll bring y'all over here too. That too, that could very well be why. So A1, 1, B1, 3, blah, 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 2, and then 4. I'm just going to spend maybe one more minute on this whole thing and then proceed. Screw it. Yeah, I'll leave them where they are. All right. So next up, I'm going to do, or continue doing rather, the M.2 SSDs. I'm pretty happy to be going all flash, no mechanical storage at all. My existing PC has a 120 gig Kingston HyperX 3K SATA 3 SSD. It's been doing fine for the most part. It has been pretty low on space for quite some time. So I wanted to get something bigger as well as something that is faster. Just double checking to make sure that the screws are actually the ones they are wanting people to use for the SSD screws. And of course, motherboard manuals are very problematic when it comes to finding something specific. All right, so the English portion of the manual is extremely short, and it does not cover the items that come with the motherboard. So I'll go ahead and disassemble the little heatsink shroud for the chipset. By the way, the ASRock 4 heatsink came with its own screwdriver. It's a very long screwdriver so that you can easily get to the mounting brackets. Apparently it's too big for the screws on the cover here, so I will use this one instead. So this heatsink assembly seems to have only 2 screws on it. I'll have to be careful with the other screw since that is where the chipset fan is located. Hopefully, because my setup is fairly straightforward, hopefully it's not going to be ramping up too much. And by simply straightforward, I mean that I'm going to try and overclock the processor, but from what I've read so far, overclocking Ryzen 3000, at least right now, is incredibly at this time. Of course, I'm having issues getting this off. All right. A little bit of force always works, I guess. So I think I'm back now. I was looking at the phone, the stream was going just fine, and then all of a sudden it just went away. So should be back now. Where I was is, I don't know if that was actually captured on video when this heatsink kind of just came off, but I was giving a close-up shot of the chipset heatsink right here, and it's I'm thinking the label needs to be pulled off first. I've read that M.2 SSDs like these, the label can act as a heatsink, or not a heatsink, a heat spreader to some extent. So because we're using one that directly touches the heatsink here, I think it makes most sense to take that off. There is a little protective film here as well. I'm going to pull that off of that and trash it. And let's go ahead and get the first SSD in place. Now let's go ahead and get that screwed down. It is the 2280 form factor. Now, I am no M.2 professional, but I don't think the screw I chose is for this. If it is, I don't know if it's supposed to be giving way like that. Let me double check the manual. The very unhelpful manual. Let's see, page 35 discusses the M.2 installation. It doesn't say anything about the screw size. So this is a pretty useless manual so far. I think the only reason to use it is to get the front panel connectors sorted out. I'm not confident leaving it like that, so I'm going to take a look at some of these other screws. Each of these screw bags has a barcode on it. So I'm going to Google those right now to see if these attach to anything. AK. Okay, so that one doesn't respond to anything. So apparently, actually no, that can't be right. So one of the Google search results says that you have to create a standoff. But the motherboard didn't really come with enough to do that. It came with 4 screw bags. There's 1 standoff. But it looks like both of the M.2 slots already has one. So far, I'm not happy with the motherboard manual. It does not really say that much. And I can't screw down the screw any further. It just won't go down. I think what has to be done is, I don't know. I did not think freaking M.2 drives would be complicated like this. I was expecting the hardest part of the entire build not being cable management, because there aren't really that many cables, but the heatsink fan installation. But early on, the M.2 drive is throwing a curveball. So that's where it is if it's all the way down. But the standoff appears to be too tall? There's a little standoff here. Now, interestingly, okay, just made a discovery. This standoff so the app crashed again. Phone's not even that hot. Don't know why it keeps doing that, but I'll just keep restarting it if it keeps doing that. I just noticed that the standoff for this M.2 drive has a raised portion on it, but the one for the second M.2 drive does not. It's totally flat. So if I can find one that is flat, which is actually what this standoff looks like, I should be good to go. So now it's a matter of getting these off. And of course, I have to get an extra tool for that because I don't have a socket wrench to take this one off. I wonder why they did that. So just to confirm my theory, let me put on this one and then screw its screw into place. So I wonder how I'm supposed to get that standoff out because I don't have the correct socket for it. Pliers could very well work. That's a good idea. Always use force. Force gets everything done. So yeah, in this case, it's the perfect height for that for this M.2 drive. This one, not so much. So I'm going to take the drive out and figure out, because finger force is definitely not going to get it out. They tightened the crap out of that. Shoot. Yeah, I'm gonna have to go get pliers. Actually, even though that would probably be the faster thing to do, I'm going to try a different method of force. Could potentially damage things, but why not? Nope, that actually will not work. So I'm going to be back in a couple of minutes and try and get this off. And while I'm over there, I'm going to take the one that should be on here in the first place, which I'll give a closer look at that. This one does not have the raised edge on this side. I have no idea what that raised edge is supposed to be for, but with it there, I cannot properly mount the M.2 drive where it needs to go. All right, so that was easier than expected. Pliers definitely worked. It was actually already pretty loose, so I barely had to turn it with the pliers. So with this, oh, and thanks Oskari Jarvinen. Apologies if I pronounced that incorrectly, but that worked. So next step is to screw down the primary M.2 drive, followed by putting the heatsink back on. Which I will try and do now. Okay, so I'm actually a dumbass. There was a reason that longer standoff was used. Because it's used for the heatsink. Because now I have no way to screw it in because that's where that would have gone. So there are reasons for these things. Now I have to swap out those standoffs. All right. And we're not even to the case yet, so this might take a while. Whoops, could have left that in. Take the standoff out. I'm gonna need pliers again to swap it out again. Yep, I'm gonna have to go back and do the pliers real quick to get these swapped back out. Actually, before I do that, I'm gonna confirm whether or not this is even going to mount correctly. So it would go on like that. Would there be enough gap for the SSD to be pushed back down? I guess so. That's got to be why they used a longer standoff. Interesting. So I'm gonna have to go out and get these swapped again. Actually, I'm just gonna go bring the pliers inside. Pliers, though, are still a good idea for getting these standoffs swapped. I'm thinking this standoff that I just took back off might be for the M.2 Wi-Fi standoff over here. The one it has looks pretty short. So now let's take the one that was originally installed and put it back. We'll put the M.2 drive back in the spot. And then we'll take the chipset heatsink fan. Right there. And I guess that does the trick. There we go. So that makes sure that the heatsink is firmly planted on top of that M.2 drive. So with that, the last thing to do before putting the motherboard in the case is to install the heatsink fan. Now I'm debating doing that now or after the motherboard is mounted. Now I've got all the components for that right here. I've got the extra fan brackets as well as the AMD specific stuff. I want to make sure this goes on correctly the first time. So I'm cranking out the heatsink fan manual. For the AMD socket, step one is to, I don't know, nothing is numbered. Remove the plastic retainers of the AMD retention module. The factory fitted backplate affixed to the rear of the motherboard will be needed. So do I take it off or not? That is confusing. So yes, according to the guide, these plastic clips have to come off. That is actually how it worked on my recent ITX build from a couple months ago. I had to take off the plastic portions first or else the included heatsink fan would not mount correctly. I actually really like the way this RAM looks. It was the cheapest 2x8 kit for DDR4 3600 megahertz. I'm hoping it will post correctly and run at the correct XMP speeds. That is sometimes tricky. Now it says to install the Be Quiet brackets and use the AM4 specific holes. Do I use the screws that it came with? It looks like it, yes. In addition to those, I have to use the 4 standoffs, which are in this little pouch. but they are not picturing the nut or the nuts that come in the sack. Whoops, just dropped one on the floor. All right, so the way these need to be situated is like so. So the standoffs easily slide over the mounting screws on the motherboard. So those washers are actually for AM3 sockets, so I do not need those. So I will put those back in. And it kind of looks like I just lost one already. Right there. So after looking through the heatsink fan instructions, this actually looks fairly straightforward. Once we get this mounting set up, it's just a matter of screwing the heatsink onto the mounting portion of the motherboard. So with all that in place, we'll put this one on. This is the largest heatsink fan I have installed onto a motherboard before. I almost went with the Noctua heatsink fan, but I just wasn't a fan of the colors of the pre-installed fans, which of course I could have gone with third-party fans, but you're already paying for two of them. And they're kind of ugly, so I opted to switch to different ones. In this case, the Be Quiet heatsink fan is all black, which fits the overall look fairly well as well. So that was a reason why I opted to go for it. Its cooling performance is supposedly really good, so I'm looking forward to seeing how well it can cool a 3700X, because it's still a fairly fresh processor and there's not a lot of information about it right now. So that is prepped. The next thing is to apply some thermal paste onto the processor. So if we take a look at the mount for, rather the pad for the processor on the heatsink, there is no pre-applied thermal paste. The heatsink fan did come with a small tube. I do not know how effective it is. So I am curious to find that out. So you can see that they gave you barely any thermal paste in this tube, which is good because that kind of regulates how much you should even apply onto the processor. Sometimes you would use too much, then it kind of spills over the side of the processor. So I'm just going to, instead of the drop or grain of rice method, I'm just going to put some in a diagonal, or rather an X pattern, like so. Hopefully that will be enough. Actually, spread the thermal paste onto the surface of the processor. Based on those instructions, I will attempt to do that the best that I can. Which begs the question, why didn't they just apply some onto the CPU portion? I'm having a hard time getting enough of it out. Seems to be drying fairly quickly. This looks like a really awful application. So hopefully there are only 4 people watching this. So I'm going to stick with my theory of they only give you enough to apply as much as they think is necessary. So that's pretty much everything in the tube. Actually, there's a fair bit left in the nozzle, but there's no real way of getting what's remaining out. So I'm just going to leave it like this. If the cooling performance isn't quite as expected, I will reevaluate that. Next up is to remove the 2 screws from the top of the heatsink fan. Do that, that, and that. Looks pretty straightforward. So the first one's removed, the second one is coming off now. The Be Quiet logo is already oriented in the correct position, but this top plate can be taken off so that you can spin it around however it needs to be. Before I do that, I have to get this piece. It's good that it doesn't move around freely. That actually goes in afterwards. So the heatsink is now on top of the processor. Need to get this mounting bracket in place. Like so. Now for the final step, which is to screw it in place. Screw that side a little bit in, and then do the other side. This is going to be a very heavy motherboard. In terms of the level of tightness, it just says well, it doesn't really say how much to tighten it, so don't want to overdo it. Just to where it cannot be turned easily any further. take a closer look at this to make sure everything appears evenly screwed in. Don't want it to be lifting up anywhere. From what I can tell, everything is pretty even looking. But I feel like this side didn't get as many screws in, but it should be just fine. Okay, so now we'll put on these little caps, which are actually pretty handy. It's also nice and handy that they included the long screwdriver so that you can easily get to where you need to be. So, not quite as bad as I thought. You don't have to go to the back of the motherboard or use the motherboard cutout in the back of the case to get to anything. So the next step is to mount the center fan for the push-pull setup. So that slides into place like so. Let me get the first mounting bracket. I actually practiced this last week because the heatsink fan arrived pretty quickly compared to everything else. I've never worked with this type of fan mounting thing before, so I wanted to give that a try. It's not the greatest of mounting mechanisms, I think. But if it works, it works. Obviously, I don't want the fan to just be sitting on top of that middle bracket for the heatsink mount itself. Yep, so that looks good. Clearance is okay as well. This is extremely heavy. Well, not too heavy, but relatively speaking, of course. So that side is good. I'll go and do this side. One, two, third row from the top. There we go. So that unfortunately did scratch a little bit of the fins, or a couple of the fins on this side. I could probably just use a black permanent marker to cover that up. This fin is actually bent down a little bit. Whatever. That's still another question I hope will be okay. I don't know if this is going to fit in the case. I vaguely remember checking the clearance with the case specs to make sure that the heatsink this tall is actually going to fit. I'm confident it will. If not, I'll just have to use the heatsink fan that came with the 3700X. So the motherboard is almost prepped. Almost forgot to use the fan joiner here so that I can just plug one thing into the motherboard instead of two. I noticed there are 3 fan headers, 3 system fan headers, there might be a 4th, and then a couple of CPU/water cooling pump headers on the board. So it's got everything that I would ever want. I wish I could just custom link these cables. I'm just going to plug this one into CPU fan 1 for now. Then I'll wrap that around some other time. Okay, on to the case. So the fun stuff. I'm going to get some of these plastic bags out of the way. I'll open up the IO shield, get that ready to go. There have been a couple of builds where I would put on the motherboard before I do the back plate, meaning the motherboard has to come all the way out. So this is a very heavy motherboard with that heatsink installed. That is fantastic. Now before I do that, I'm actually going to install this secondary front case fan. That should be fairly straightforward. I do like the way this case looks. I'm just going to take the glass off first. Oh snap, up to 7 live viewers. That is the max I think I've seen this hit so far. I've been streaming for just over an hour. Oh, it just went up to 8. That I think is a new record. From what I can tell, the stream on my laptop looks completely solid. It doesn't appear to be shaky or anything. Because the camera is on a tripod mount. So theoretically, it should be as steady as can be. So the side panel is now removed, obviously. The front panel comes off all in one piece, no cables attached to it. I was considering another ITX case, well not another, a micro ATX cube case. I think it was by Thermaltake, and I want to say it's called the V20. That looks pretty cool, but on a desk it apparently takes up more space than I would like. So here's what the inside of the front panel looks like. Some sound dampening material. Now let's take the front intake fan over here. Mount it the same orientation as the one that's already installed. Like so. Fortunately, installing Windows 10 has gotten a lot faster than earlier versions of Windows, where it would take upwards of half an hour. Yep, between 8 and 15 minutes is pretty much what it seems like nowadays. Even to a hard drive, it's pretty speedy. Another thing to note is this PC, I think, only has one area where there's RGB, which would be the GIGABYTE logo on the GPU. Since I never look inside of the PC, I do not even care about having fancy lights everywhere. I think Yuri HL may have started from the beginning and might not be caught up right now. He's talking about a DVD drive, which I can only imagine is because of the brief amount of time when I showed the previous PC. I'm going to comment real quick. I think that person is behind. Because when I did go over there, that's when a couple of people were talking about the audio going out. So I'm pretty sure that's where he is right now. That's what I thought was happening, because the PC I'm showing now does not have a DVD drive, so it had to have been earlier. But that's okay. If people want to start from the beginning, that's fine. All right, so the case fan on the front is installed. So now we've got two intakes instead of just the one that came with the case. Front dust filter is back on, and I think that is it for the front, so the front panel can go back on as well. This is my first experience with a Fractal design product, and so far every part of it feels very solid. I'm pretty satisfied with everything. But yes, the PC, the white one you were looking at earlier, does have a DVD drive, which when I first built it 8 years ago, it was still more relevant than it is now. Plus I have an external one now, just in case I ever do need to use a disc, I can do so. So the back plate, or the IO shield rather, goes on like so. Finally move the camera up so everybody can see what I'm talking about. We're still at 8 live viewers. That is way more than I was expecting. I thought it was just going to be a couple of people. I'm just over here in the kitchen talking to myself. Okay. Why did you choose to use the Corsair MP510? Here is the label that I took off the SSD. So I picked that because it was a pretty good price. It's got pretty good performance. It has a black PCB, which in this case doesn't matter because it's under a heatsink, but the value was there. It's a very fast SSD. It's by a reliable company, so I opted to go for that. For the boot drive, now if you missed it earlier, there are actually two SSDs. This is an all-flash build. So if we take another look at the motherboard, I do have a Patriot memory Viper VPN100 1TB SSD. So the Corsair is going to be used for Windows and software. The other one I have dedicated to games and documents. Because I'd rather have dual drives so that if one fails, the other one still has something on it, rather than one drive failing and everything is gone. I thought about using music, but it would probably get too distracting for myself. Okay, I need to lay the case down, and I don't really have a smooth or safe surface for it except for this rubber mat. So I will reposition it. That's not bad. Yes, that was me. Only in a couple of Discords. Going to reposition the tripod real quick so we can get a closer look inside of everything. That should be good enough for now. I should have taken the back plate off, or the other side panel off, so I can move some of the cables out of the way. That's going to be pushing up against the board. Let me do that real quick. I think some of the hardest parts are out of the way now, primarily being the motherboard prep, although I was actually planning on that being the easiest part, but the heatsink was a little difficult for both the CPU as well as the chipset / the first M.2 drive. All right, now for the motherboard installation. The case came with a box of screws and other stuff. Which I have no idea where any of that is right now. I thought I had everything all sorted out and easy to access, and I can't find the box for the case. What in the world did I do with those? Aha. So, in here we get a bunch of screws, some standoffs, a standoff tool, which would have been handy earlier actually, some zip ties. All right, so since this is a micro ATX board, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 that are needed, if I counted correctly. Which, if that's the case, there should only be one extra. So we've got our gold standoffs. We're going to use a standoff tool to get everything in place. It would just be fantastic if the standoffs came pre-installed. Oh, look at that, we're up to 9 viewers. Interesting. I better please the audience. How would you guys like me to please you? Okay, so just reevaluating everything once more. It looks like there's already one standoff in the case, right there in the middle. I'm going to pre-position the motherboard in the case real quick, just to verify how many standoffs are required. Which, of course, if they're not lined up, it's not going to matter. So, that was pretty pointless. So we've got one in the top left, one near the CPU fan headers, and one in the top right corner. Okay, I'll do those. Gosh, this is so tedious. Maybe this is why they don't pre-install the standoffs. Because you have to start to screw it, and the standoff has to be completely straight, or it doesn't go in. Might help if I try this from the other side. So again, this is a micro ATX case. I did not want to go ATX because I don't use all of the PCI Express slots, so I'm just paying for nothing. And having all the extra room inside for nothing was ultimately a waste of space. So I wanted something smaller and a little more compact. This is still being a pain. There we go. First one looks to be all right. Looking for a screwdriver. Using the standoff helper definitely helps. I guess that's why they call it that. They don't seem to screw all the way down, but rather most of the way. I'm going to compare this with the locations on the board. Yep. The standoff goes right near, actually maybe it is supposed to go to the bottom of the board. Yep. Four down, 3 to 4 more to go. Now I did hold the video card up to the side panel of the case earlier, and it looks like it's pretty much going to go all the way up to the front intake fans, which I think is actually a good thing since it's going to be blowing air directly onto the video card. So theoretically it should remain cooler than in a larger case. A larger case would have a lot more room for the airflow to be disrupted by other stuff, so it might not have gotten as much air in that kind of case. So 2 standoffs left. From what I can tell, that's all of them. Ah, nope. There are a couple more to go. All right, so all the standoffs are there. Now it's time to mount everything. Expansion slot covers. I'm going to route the rear fan cable back through there just for now, kind of in the way. There's the top one, there's the second one, and then just going to put this fan cable. Just trying to find the standoff. There we go. So everything appears to be, it's super plain. I'll show you guys a better view shortly. All right, so now it's time for the 8 motherboard screws. Board screws into a separate bag. the ITX build I did a couple months ago, all the screws were thrown into the same bag, so trying to find the specific ones was a real pain. So fortunately, all of these came out just fine in a single bag, and they are all black. What do people usually talk about on PC building streams? It's just myself in here. And actually it looks like it's going to be a non-issue. It's got cable management grommets right next to the motherboard where your front panel cables and your 24-pin motherboard power would go as well. So it looks like there actually is not. Looks like there are some other grommets located towards the top of the motherboard for the CPU power. So that's pretty convenient as well. So the motherboard is officially mounted in place. I'm going to go to the back of the board in a moment to take a closer look at that. So the RAM and the fan. So fortunately I didn't get RAM that was extremely tall, or else I would have to lift the fan up, which would have been okay. But there's also chassis fan 3. There is a chassis fan 1 way up in the top. That's where the rear exhaust will go. So I'm not going to plug anything in yet. Instead, I'm going to 2070 Super WINDFORCE OC by GIGABYTE. Almost went for the 2080 Super, but it's 30% more money for just a 20 something, or maybe a 10% improvement in performance. So the value to me was just simply not there. I need to move the rear fan cable out of the way, or else obviously this will not work. Since we're looking at it, here is what the back plate looks like. Can't tell if that's plastic or metal. That's what this is for. I'll just leave that there for now. We've got 3 fans. The GIGABYTE logo on the top is supposedly RGB, which I do not care about. All right, so with it correctly inserted, there's enough room for... Actually, before I do that, I need to make sure the video card's not blocking anything in the way of... But so far, I don't see anything there that would get in the way, so I'm not too concerned. Just some SATA ports, which I can still get to some of them if I have to. So I will screw in the video in addition to what looks like a 16x slot that is wired for X4. I think that's what it looks like. But because this is PCI Express Gen 4 on the motherboard, in terms of what it supports, should be okay in terms of bandwidth for that bottom slot. So the video card is securely into place. I think the last thing is to get the power supply installed and everything plugged in. Now before I do that, I'm going to do the front panel connections. Those can often be so next step is to let me check something real quick. Whoops. All right, so all the front panel connectors, how am I going to do this? Yeah, I'm going to get the power supply installed first, just to get that out of the way. Then I should know how much room I have in the bottom area here. So before I do that, I need to think about where or how I would like the power supply oriented. I typically like to mount it so that the fan is facing the bottom. I do not want it facing the top because I don't want it to pull in hot air from inside the system. Or at least that is the idea. So this looks pretty straightforward to install on the back of the case, which you can't see right now. Can't really see this mounting bracket. All right, for the 4 power supply screws, those are in this bag. Nope, this bag. Looking for the ones with a flat top. Which so far I do not see anything else that looks like the power supply screws. Which is actually okay because the power supply came with some screws. So I will just use those. Just getting to the final stages right now. Looks like this app died again. Should be back now. Just noticed that something came with the microfiber cloth. I guess the case came with this. I did not see this anywhere when I took the case out of the box. So, interesting. Don't know where exactly it came from. It just kind of popped up out of nowhere. So, almost done actually. Just need to mount this bracket onto the power supply. One down, 3 to go. And for the last one, which actually looks like it's just out of view. So I need to adjust some of the screws. There we go. Chat. All 5 people, actually I'm one of those, so all 4 extra viewers, because it is too quiet right now, I will reiterate my goal with this build. Hertz. In doing that, I had to lower the graphics settings for some games, which I wasn't a fan of. Not only that, but today's computer hardware is extremely attractive. So Ryzen processors, NVIDIA graphics, AMD graphics are kind of making a small comeback as well, but they're not quite as competitive yet. So it just seems like a new build. The least entertaining portion of any PC build, the cable management. I'm going to turn it around to the front. And I think I'm going to take the front panel off one more time so I can clean up the front cables first. And this front panel is on there. It's on there pretty tight. I don't think anything broke just now, so should be okay. Actually, what that did was absolutely nothing. Alright, so that front fan is routed through there. This one is routed through that side. Because they pre-managed some of the cabling here. So it's got these 3 ties to try and keep the front panel cables nice and tidy. You know you've done a good job when they're asking where the cables are. So I'm taking some of the pre-installed zip ties off so I can better route everything. So here we've got 2 front. Sys fan headers are located. It's going to be hard to view anything for probably the rest of this video. So the first thing I'm going to try and manage, like I just mentioned, would be the front panel system fans. So the intake fans. There's a chassis fan header. So 2 of them are right next to each other, so I found a little opening in this area for that. So that goes on fairly easily. This should actually be a very clean setup on the inside. I'm more excited about this than I have been. Very few cables should actually be seen here. Man, I should have done a little bit of this before actually getting everything screwed in. All right, there's the first one. still a little bit of slack there, which is good. And now the second one, that's gonna go in the same opening as that. And that is gonna go in for sysfan 3. Right there. Now for the rear exhaust fan, that is going to go in pretty much all the way in the top right corner. So first I have to figure out where I want this cable to basically route, because I can't first route it through an opening like with the other fans, because it's pretty much right next to where it has to be plugged into. Yep, chassis fan 1 is in a very difficult spot. If I had a girlfriend, I could probably ask her to plug this in. That assumes she has small hands. I need some more light for this one. Yep, so I need to face up. I'm having fear that this is going to be the most difficult part of the cable management process. Simply cannot get this front I don't think I'm going to be able to do this without having to take the heatsink off. It's all the way in the corner. A clip tool. I I do not know what a clip tool is. Of course, the app crashed yet again, so it should be back now. Next, I'll do the CPU power. Just a simple 8-pin, theoretically simple. Fine, I'll finally look into the quality issues. Check Discord, okay? Ah, yes. That would have been handy. By the way, when the app crashed again, I did lower the bitrate just a little bit from I think 4.5 megabits to about 3,000 kilobits. So that decrease might help a little bit. Just trying to get it oriented so it can bend back around correctly. Alright, so that one is in there pretty well. All the cables are straight, nothing is tangled or anything like that. So that's nice to see. All right, next up is motherboard main power. That should hopefully be another simple one because all that is right here. There we go. I was just waiting for it to clip into place even a little bit. Just want to make sure there's not too much tension on the cables either. I don't want anything to snap off. Not bad so far. Next up is front panel stuff. So all the fans are plugged in. The 3 case fans, the 2 heatsink fans. I will zip tie all this stuff down later. All right, so the front panel, which I've been trying to avoid. Okay, first we will do, where did the USB 3 header go? This one. All right. I was worried there for a moment. That one goes right next to motherboard power. So that one is plugged in. Next up is GPU power. I should have plugged this into the power supply earlier before actually mounting the power supply. So I'm going to need a flashlight, I think, to do this. Looking at the heatsink fan now, it is barely able to fit in this case. There is not a whole lot of room. I like how all of these cables are flat already, so that everything looks better. GPU is right there. There is the 4-pin. There is the 3-pin, and of course I don't need the 3-pin, but I don't have a place to put that. So I'll leave it right there. Probably can't get any better than that. All right. Did I test the PSU before putting it in the case? No, and I have never done that with any build. But it's only a matter of time for that to be a problem. I'm confident this will work, because there has been a 100% success rate so far. But as I just mentioned, that can change at any time. So I will take my chances and not test it yet. HD audio is all the way in the bottom right or bottom left corner where all the audio components are. So that is an easy one to plug in. I was pretty happy with the ATX build I made a couple months ago. Everything turned on correctly on the first try. All the front panel connectors were good. Just as long as you have everything plugged into the correct spot, there should be no problem with everything booting on the first try. Whoops, I had this off-centered the whole time. Man, when is there going to be a motherboard standard where all of this just plugs into one cable all the way on the right side of the board, instead of being all the way in a corner? There we go. All right, HD audio is plugged in. Next up, front panel stuff. So all of these little cables, untangle these the best that I can. So the usual set include power LED, power switch, hard drive LED, reset switch. So for those, I will go back to the motherboard manual and figure out what goes where. Okay, front panel audio, don't care. So hard drive plus is on the bottom, the reset switch goes there. As soon as I finish this, I will try and tie everything down a little bit, and that might be everything. All right, so these I will route through the small hole in the power supply area. First up is hard drive LED plus and then minus. So plus is left. I'm going to do the one on top of that first, which is for the power LED plus minus. So they go in like so. That was kind of luck. They both just kind of fell into place. Just have to push them down. LED is there. Power button goes in next. Which is let me double check everything here. Plus minus. So that one should remain empty. I need to do the hard drive LEDs next before that gets too difficult. Next is power button. Then after that, there will just be one more, and then I will plug in the power to the power supply and at least make sure everything turns on. All 9 fans. There are 9 fans in this system. 3 for the GPU, 3 case fans, 2 for the CPU, and 1 for the device. Lots of air power in this. Almost there. Last up is the reset button. All of these have labels facing downwards, so that makes it a little bit easier to get all of these plugged in correctly. All right, everything's plugged in. I'm going to pull the cables through a little bit so there's not as much there. Cable management. So let me get a better angle here for the first power on. All right, so power cable. It will either all turn on just fine or something will go up in smoke. All right, power is plugged into the power supply. The switch is on. Push the power button on the top, and absolutely nothing. Maybe the power supply was off. Yep. Okay, so red light on the motherboard. Don't know if that's good or not. Both intake fans are feeding the heatsink. The intake fan for the heatsink is on. Can't tell if the middle one is on because there's no way to really get a good view of it. The GPU light is on and everything just turned off, so Could be some problems with the RAM. I mean, I did get 3600 megahertz instead of 3200. So that could be posing some problems, in which case I'm going to be really disappointed in spending money on 3600 when I could have just gotten 32. So the chipset fan, oh, 10 fans, excuse me, I forgot about that one. I'm just going to assume that the middle fan for the heatsink is turning on. Still can't get a good view of it. Yeah, I'm not totally convinced that this middle fan is on because I can't see it. I'm gonna stop the front fan real quick and take a look. Nope, still can't even get a good look at it, but I can feel air coming through. So I assume it's going. So red light on motherboard. At least I know that everything is turning on successfully. It's an X570 motherboard, so that's AMD's, I guess, highest end consumer level chipset for the new 3000 series, so this board should be okay. I just think it definitely has to do with the RAM speed, in which case I'm not even sure how it's going to post, because I do have 3200 megahertz RAM in the ATX build I could put in here and see if that posts. It could actually be trying to output something right now, I'm not entirely sure. Currently just trying to go through the motherboard to see if it explains anything about a red light. Post status checker. Post status checker diagnoses the computer when user powers on the machine. It emits a red light to indicate whether the CPU, memory, VGA, or storage is dysfunctional. Okay, so one red light could mean something is wrong with 4 different types of products: the processor, memory, video card, storage. So this is going to be interesting to try and figure out. I'm tempted to take out the RAM. Oh god, that's going to be a pain in the ass with this huge CPU fan. I feel like it's the RAM. That's just got to be the only thing. But I wonder if, in this case, it would at least output something onto the screen. The red light comes on immediately. It could be storage. I don't know. I would doubt it though. That's probably the least to have problems. So I do have 3200 megahertz RAM in an ITX build that I'm still trying to sell. I might have to take a stick out and see if that helps. For now, all the connections seem to be working. Plenty of airflow on the inside, hopefully, to keep things cool. I mean, there's pretty much a dedicated front fan blowing onto the GPU. Another one for the heatsink. So I'm going to call this a partial success, and then I'm going to end the stream. I'm going to clean things up a little bit first. Get the front panel back on. At this point, I likely won't even be able to do game testing for probably not until tomorrow. Just getting Windows installed and everything stress tested on its own is gonna take some time. The fan that I am hearing right now is the chipset fan, which is a new addition to to AMD chipsets. And that's definitely the loudest one. So that was something RAM location was something I was stuck on for a little bit. At first I had A1 and B1 populated. I wasn't convinced, so I put them in A2 and B2. I'm thinking what I'll do, since this should be easy, is I'll just put A2 and B2 into A1 and B1. Because you think they would be labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, but they have A1, B1, A2, B2, which to me is not that straightforward. So I'm going to try that real quick. I always say real quick, but moving the RAM location isn't going to be quick. Whoops, there's a screwdriver over there. Hopefully that's going to do the trick, because I don't really want to spend that much time diagnosing all of this stuff. I just want to start using it, because getting Windows installed, I'm going to start completely from scratch. New copy of Windows. Software is going to be reinstalled. Some of the games are going to transfer over from my existing PC. So I'm not going to use any zip ties to keep the cables in check, but I will put the back panel on. Actually, I'm going to leave it off for now, since if I do plug in my 3.5-inch hard drive to transfer stuff, I can at least plug in the power cable. Alright, so this is going to be not fun, because currently the only slot that I have easy access to is slot number 4, so the one all the way on the right. Let me adjust the camera real quick. So actually the end of the fan is flush with the 4th RAM stick. So I think the easiest thing to do right now is to take the heatsink off. Taking just this fan off, whoops, I think is going to be a pain. I just don't like how these types of fans use these types of clips. It's just hard to get things in place. On second thought, maybe not. Yeah, so this might be easier than expected. I just have to pull it back a little bit. Oh my gosh. Getting these back on might suck. So there's the front fan removed. I can kind of get access to the first slot. Let me do that one first. Almost finished. All right, the heatsink's gonna have to come off. I can't lift it up enough to get into slot 1 unless I want to scratch the heat spreader. This might be okay. Nah, I can't get in there sideways. Yeah, the heatsink's gonna have to come off. Not the biggest of issues. What's going to be, oh, that middle fan is in the way. I can't do that. Which means I have to take the video card out to get to the little fan clip on for the middle fan. That first slot is just a bit too low. If I can just force it up a little bit. Gosh, I don't want to break the slot. There we go. Okay, hopefully that is good enough. Had to force this end of the heatsink up a little bit so I can just barely squeeze the heat spreader from the RAM under it. Which, of the build so far, that has been the scariest thing that I've attempted. So RAM 1 and 2 are in their places. Let me move these fan clips out, and then I'm going to plug everything in. I probably should have done that, just try RAM slot 1 first, but since I have 1 and 3 populated now, I'm going to just try it again. Oh, what was that noise? Okay, so red light on the motherboard again. This is pretty concerning. I will try your suggestion and not RAM slot 1. I said 1 RAM slot. Are you implying any RAM slot? So with both installed, 1 and 3, there's a red light. So I'm just going to try one stick in the leftmost slot. Immediate red LED still. Can't rule out bad RAM, but is that realistically it? I'm thinking I need to plug in something into the video card to see if there's any type of video output, because it could be telling me what's going wrong. Or at least that's what I hope will happen. There's got to be something on the screen. So on that note, since my phone is just about dead, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. The build is partially complete. Obviously, I have to figure out why it's not, well, or figure out why it's displaying a red light. So that's going to be it for this video. It's been about 2 hours and 20 minutes, I think. It's a pretty good build. I like everything so far. Cable management is not really that big of a problem because there's cable management holes everywhere. No SATA drives to worry about either. You should always connect the video cable to a new build. Video cable to a new build? I don't understand. Yeah, I'm gonna go do that real quick, plug this in, see if anything shows up on the screen, and go from there. So that is it with this video, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one.